Welcome to Uniquely Spoken Podcast, empowering healthcare, where transparency sparks transformation. Are you ready to dive into conversations that will spark ideas and inspire action? This is a podcast that refuses to accept the status quo. Welcome to episode 24, part 2 of 3, the orientation illusion, why new employees struggle. In our last episode, we talked about what I call the orientation illusion. We examined the difference between orientation and onboarding, and we followed Danielle, a new CMA who entered the field excited, motivated, and eager to succeed. At that point in the story, everything looked promising. She completed orientation. She got her badge. She met people. She signed forms. She completed training modules. On paper, she was ready. But here's the question I want you to think about before we continue. How many employees have you seen leave within their first 6 months who look completely fine during orientation? Most of them didn't fail on day one. They failed weeks later when the information overload started to collide with real-world responsibilities. And that is where we're picking up the story today. Let's talk about what actually happens inside a human brain during a typical orientation day. Because I think if more leaders understood the neuroscience here, they'd design orientation completely differently. Think about everything a new hire in our field is expected to absorb in the first few days. Infection control protocols, abuse and neglect reporting requirements, HEPA regulations, emergency codes, fire safety procedures, the facility's documentation system, resident rights, incident reporting, chain of command, dress code, timekeeping systems, and, depending on the role, clinical skills like medication administration, wound care documentation, or transfer and mobility techniques. That's not a training day. That's an entire semester of coursework compressed into 16 or 24 hours. Human working memory has limits. This isn't a motivational or generational issue. It's basic cognitive science. When information comes in faster than the brain can encode it into long-term memory, the brain doesn't magically expand its capacity. It starts dropping information. And here's the cruel part. The brain doesn't tell you which pieces it's dropping. Nobody raises their hand in orientation and says, I didn't retain that. They just nod along, because nodding along is what you do when you don't want to be the person who slows down the room. This is why we see the gap between exposure and mastery. Exposure means information was presented. Mastery means information can be recalled and applied under pressure, in real time, with a resident in front of you. Orientation almost exclusively produces exposure. It rarely produces mastery. And yet, we schedule new employees as if mastery is what happened. Let's make this concrete with a few examples from our world. Medication administration. A new medication aide or nurse might sit through a class on the 5 rights of medication administration, review the facility's specific MedPass documentation process, and even do a supervised pass or 2. Then, within days, they're handed a med cart with 20 or 30 residents on it, on a unit they don't know yet, with medications they've never personally administered, under time pressure, because the pass has to be completed within a certain window. The classroom taught them the concept. The floor is where mastery would actually have to be built. And mastery takes repetition, feedback, and time, not a single supervised pass. Documentation. New employees are shown the electronic health record system in a training environment, often on a laptop in a conference room, clicking through sample charts that don't reflect the chaos of a real shift. Then they're expected to accurately document real-time care on real residents while call lights are going off and a family member is asking a question in the hallway. The system they were shown in a quiet room bears almost no resemblance to the system they now have to operate under pressure. Resident care routines. Every long-term resident has individual preferences, care plan nuances, and behavioral patterns that took the existing staff months or years to learn. A new employee is told, check the care plan, which is good advice, but care plans don't capture the 1,000 small things. That Mr. Alvarez prefers his pills after getting out of bed. That Mrs. Chen gets anxious if you approach from her left side. That a particular resident's agitation is actually a signal that he needs to use the bathroom. That knowledge lives in the collective memory of the existing staff, and there's no orientation binder that transfers it. It has to be taught in real time by people who are patient enough to explain it, which brings us to the next problem. Emergency procedures. Fire drills and code trainings are reviewed in the classroom, sometimes with a quiz at the end. But the actual experience of responding to a real emergency, a resident fall, a choking incident, a rapid change in condition, activates a completely different part of the brain than sitting in a classroom reviewing a policy. Under real stress, people fall back on what's been rehearsed, not what's been read. If the only rehearsal was a slideshow, the new employee's brain has nothing reliable to fall back on in the moment it matters most. Here's the pattern across every one of these examples. Information was delivered, but competence wasn't built. And the gap between those two things is exactly where new employees start to quietly panic, cover, guess, and eventually withdraw. Which brings us to Ray and Carol. In almost every skilled nursing facility I've worked with, the person assigned to train a new hire is chosen based on availability, not teaching ability. Somebody's on the schedule. Somebody's willing. Somebody's been there a while. That person becomes the preceptor. Rarely is that person selected because they've been trained to teach, coached on how to give feedback, or given any kind of standardized curriculum to follow. The result is exactly what happened to Danielle. 3 different preceptors, 3 different ways of doing the same task, and a new employee left to reconcile the differences on her own. Let's talk about what this does psychologically, because the damage isn't just procedural, it's emotional. When a new employee is taught one way by one person and a contradictory way by another, their first reaction is confusion. That's normal, and honestly, that's manageable if there's a safe way to resolve the confusion, like asking a question and getting a clear answer. But here's what typically happens instead. They ask the question, and instead of a clear answer, they get a subtle judgment, an eye roll, a sigh, a you'll figure it out, an implication that asking the question itself was somehow the wrong move. After that happens 2 or 3 times, something shifts. The new employee stops interpreting the inconsistency as, these are 2 different techniques, and I should figure out which is right. They start interpreting it as, I clearly don't understand something everyone else understands. And asking makes that obvious. So I should stop asking. That's the moment confusion becomes disengagement. It's subtle and it's incredibly common. And it is almost never caught by leadership because from the outside, a disengaged new employee doesn't look dramatic. They just look quieter. They stop raising their hand in huddle. They stop lingering after shift to ask a follow-up question. Leaders often read this as a good sign. Oh, she's settling in. She's not needing as much help anymore. In reality, it's frequently the opposite. She's not needing less help. She's just stopped believing help is something she's allowed to ask for. And here's the leadership blind spot I really want to highlight. Inconsistent precepting doesn't just fail to teach a skill correctly. It actively teaches new employees that this organization doesn't have a shared standard. If Carol and Ray disagree on how to do something as fundamental as repositioning a resident, what does that tell a brand new employee about how seriously this organization has thought through its own training? It tells them that everyone is improvising, and employees who conclude the organization is improvising its training tend to lose confidence that the organization has a plan for anything else either, including their own success. This is why standardizing preceptors and giving them an actual curriculum isn't a nice to have. It is one of the highest leverage things a facility can do because a consistent message from a trained preceptor doesn't just transfer a skill correctly. It transfers a sense that the organization knows what it's doing. And that sense of organizational competence is exactly what a scared, overwhelmed new hire is desperately looking for in those first few weeks. Thanks for spending this time with me today. We've talked about information overload, inconsistent guidance, and the challenges new employees face when they're expected to perform before they've had the opportunity to build confidence. The reality is that most new hires don't wake up one morning and decide they're going to fail. More often, they're gradually pushed toward frustration, uncertainty, and disengagement, while the warning signs go unnoticed. But here's the good news. These outcomes are not inevitable. In our final episode, we'll focus on the critical first 90 days and the leadership practices that can dramatically improve retention, engagement, and long-term success. Because the question isn't whether organizations can influence employee success. The question is whether they're willing to do so intentionally. Join me for part 3. I am Juanita, the founder of Uniquely Spoken LLC. I started this podcast to ignite change in healthcare, starting with long-term care settings. It is time to transform nursing homes and rehabilitation centers, assisted living and memory care communities to all become premier long-term care settings nationwide. It is time for all long-term care settings to receive a 5-star quality and customer service rating. It starts now, and it starts with me. It starts with you, and you. And the time is now. Thank you for joining us. We broadcast every Tuesday at 8:30 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Don't forget to join the conversation, request to be a speaker, and partner in transforming long-term care settings. And don't forget to tune in next week. Thank you for joining us on Uniquely Spoken LLC podcast. Please subscribe on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen. Remember to connect with us. Follow, comment, subscribe, share, be a guest. Visit us at uniquelySpoken.com/podcast. That's UNIQUESPOKENLLC.com/podcast. Or if you are a viewer, scan our QR code. Please remember to stay informed, stay empowered, and keep the conversation going. We love hearing from you, and we'll see you next week.